This is lesson 13.3, the spread of Protestant ideas. How did Protestant ideas and institutions spread beyond German-speaking lands? So we're going to look at several of those. And we're going back to College Board Topic 1.5, New Monarchies, explain the causes and effects of the development of political institutions from 1450 to 1648. And remember, monarchs and princes, including the English rulers Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, initiated religious reform from the top down in an effort to exercise greater control over religious life and morality. Here's the first question. What does FD stand for? FD stands for Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. And in the Queen's case, it stands for Fidei Defensatrix. It dates back all the way to Henry VIII, who was given this title actually by the Pope himself for writing so eloquently in defense of papal authority. Scandinavia, let's begin there. Denmark went Protestant, in other words Lutheran, very, but not surprisingly, quickly. Danish scholars were studying under Martin Luther at the University of Wittenberg, and so they brought it back to Denmark. King Christian II was a bit of a tyrant, though, which is probably why the Swedish call him Christian the Tyrant. And the Danes also ran Norway and ran Iceland, and they instituted Protestantism there as well. Things did not go as smoothly in those places, and people in these areas resisted violently. Gustav Vasa was the king of Sweden, and he came to the throne after Christian II slaughtered the entire Swedish royal family. And he also adopted Protestant ideas, again, Lutheranism. And the Swedish church didn't officially go Lutheran, though, until 1536. Henry VIII and the Reformation in England. Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547, was actually a devout Catholic. He hated Lutheranism. He hated Martin Luther. He loved the sacraments. He loved the Catholic liturgy. Here's a picture of Henry VIII with his family. They didn't really pose for this. It was kind of a stylized picture, but you can see several important people who we'll study, including to his right, Bloody Mary, and Philip II of Spain, and to his left, Edward VI and Elizabeth I. So Henry's first wife was Catherine of Aragon. Henry was actually the younger son of his father, Henry VII. Arthur was the older brother and the heir to the throne of England. And Arthur had already been married to Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine of Aragon was actually Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter. She was also Emperor Charles V's aunt. And this made her daughter, Mary Tudor, Charles V's cousin. And she had come to England with a very large dowry, in other words, a whole lot of money. But then her husband, Arthur, who was Henry VII's older son, died of tuberculosis. Well, Arthur and Henry's dad, King Henry VII, was a miser, and he was not about to send Catherine of Aragon back to Spain and lose that huge dowry that she had come to England with. So he had his younger son, Henry, marry Catherine. That's right. Henry had to marry his dead brother's wife. And they had one child, Mary. And then they had 6 unsuccessful pregnancies in a row. And by 1527, King Henry VIII was starting to feel that God was punishing him for being in an incestuous marriage. Well, the issue of Henry VIII being unable to produce a male heir to the throne became known in polite conversation as the King's Great Matter. And if you got pulled into this deadly vortex known as the King's Great Matter, your life could be in serious danger. Innocent people were convicted of and executed for crimes they did not do. The highest officials of the English government committed heinous miscarriages of justice, and people found themselves sitting on juries where they had to convict their own blood relatives, all because of the king's great matter. See, the king's great matter refers, of course, to the difficulty that Henry VIII was having producing a male heir. England did not have a strong tradition of having queens. And so it was much more than just a matter of keeping your dynasty on the throne or keeping your family in power. It was also a matter of national stability. Well, the Lord Chancellor of England was Thomas Wolsey, and he was the Archbishop of York, and he was also a cardinal in the Catholic Church, and he was a top advisor to Henry VIII, and he visited the Pope, Clement VII, to ask for an annulment to Henry's marriage because Henry needed to marry somebody else. An annulment is kind of like a divorce, but an annulment says something slightly different. An annulment doesn't say that a marriage is over. It says that a marriage was never valid to begin with. And this annulment should have been a pretty easy thing to get, but there was a big problem. Pope Clement VII had his own problems, and Clement VII had picked the wrong side in the war between the Holy Roman Empire and France. And Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who we met in the last lesson, had taken over Rome, and Clement VII was running the papacy as Charles V's virtual prisoner. And Charles V just happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, and Charles V was also the cousin of Henry and Catherine's daughter, Mary. And Charles V promised Clement VII that he would rot in prison forever if he granted that annulment to Henry VIII. And so Charles VII stalled and stalled on Cardinal Wolsey, and Cardinal Wolsey finally had to return to England empty-handed. And as a result, Henry VIII fired Wolsey as Lord Chancellor. So Henry proposed to Parliament that they remove the church in England from papal jurisdiction. And the payoff of doing that to these nobles stood to be enormous, because a huge amount of England's land was owned by the Catholic Church, and these nobles knew that church property would be auctioned off at a steal. And so the nobles would get to be the first in line to make bids on all that awesome Catholic Church property that would be confiscated. And so Parliament made Henry VIII Pope of this new Church of England, and every English subject was made to take the oath of supremacy. And the oath of supremacy acknowledged that the King of England was the head of the Church of England. Sir Thomas More, our big-time Northern Renaissance man, our Christian humanist who wrote Utopia, he refused to take that oath, and he was beheaded. Catherine of Aragon was out of the royal family now, because as the new head of this new independent Church of England, Henry granted himself a divorce from Catherine. And Henry married his mistress, Anne Boleyn. He had also had an affair with Anne's sister, Mary. And the Archbishop of Canterbury was Thomas Cranmer. And he was a big supporter of the Reformation and of the Supremacy Act. And he declared Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine to be null and void. And their daughter, Mary, was now illegitimate. And Cranmer also declared Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn to be, quote, good and valid. And as a result, the Pope in Italy and Rome excommunicated both Henry VIII and Thomas Cranmer. Here is a painting of Catherine of Aragon begging on her knees, begging Henry not to divorce her. The begging did not work. Anne Boleyn, so she and Henry got married and had a daughter named Elizabeth. Then Anne had 3 additional miscarriages in a row. But this time, Henry VIII wasn't too worried. He was already courting Jane Seymour. He was done with Anne Boleyn. And so, in order to get rid of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII had her charged and put on trial for every scandalous crime he could think of. Anne was accused of committing adultery with 5 different men. One of those 5 was her own brother, George. All 5 of the men were found guilty. The only one who actually confessed was probably gay, meaning he was probably the least one who had done it, meaning he was innocent. 4 of the 5 men were convicted before Anne's trial even began, so therefore Anne was already prejudged. Anne's own uncle had to sit on the jury that convicted her. So Henry VIII's third wife was Jane Seymour, and she finally gave birth to a son, Edward, and then she died a few days later. And Henry had 3 more wives after that, and we don't care who they were. So what kind of church did Henry VIII favor? Keep in mind that Henry had never wanted to be a Protestant, but now he was one. And on top of that, he was the supreme leader of an entire Protestant church. And so now he is the fidei defensor, the defender of the faith of this new Protestant church. And this is why it still says FD next to the name of Queen Elizabeth II on the pound sterling to this very day. And Henry VIII had a lot of work to do in order to establish this new Anglican church. The government had to oversee the confiscation of all that Catholic church land and property, and that was a massive job. So government officials were needed to manage it and inventory it and survey it and appraise it, title it, sell it, etc. And that brought in Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was Henry VIII's chief minister, and he had to form all kinds of new governmental departments that hadn't existed before. And so he restructured Henry's entire government from top down, and all of this happened gradually over time. And in the end, Henry VIII had a government that was larger, it was more modern, it was more centralized, it was more bureaucratic, and it was also more efficient. Did everybody in England automatically buy into this new Anglican church, this new Church of England? No. Catholic tradition in England was quite strong, and people usually did not just automatically convert. Many resisted outright. Many converted to some Protestant doctrines, but kept other traditions that they liked. So in 1536, England experienced the Pilgrimage of Grace, which sounds really nice, doesn't it? The Pilgrimage of Grace. This was actually the name of a mass rebellion against forced conversion to Protestantism. And it was the largest rebellion in English history. And a truce was finally reached with the Pilgrims, that was what they called the rebels. But the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace were tried and executed. Protestantism in Ireland. So in 1536, the English-controlled Irish Parliament established the Church of Ireland, and it was modeled after the Church of England. And this Irish Parliament, don't get the wrong idea, it was made up entirely of English landlords who were acting on orders from England. No actual Irish people were represented in the Irish Parliament. Most Irish people ignored the Irish Parliament and remained Catholic. And the English used Irish resistance to Protestantism as an excuse to confiscate lots of Catholic Church property in Ireland for immense profit. And the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland was driven underground, and this would, of course, add fuel to the fire of intense Irish resentment of everything English. Upholding Protestantism in England. Henry VIII died in 1547, but that didn't stop Thomas Cranmer from solidifying Protestantism in England. Henry's successor was his son, Edward VI, and he was Henry VIII's only son, and he had been raised a Protestant. And so Thomas Cranmer simplified the Protestant church service. He invited Protestant theologians to England, and in 1549, Cranmer issued the Common Book of Prayer. And this was a prayer and services book to be used in all churches of England. Edward VI died in 1553 at the age of 15. And Henry VIII's daughter Mary took over the throne. And she was a devout Catholic, so now we're going back the other way. She was determined to make England Catholic again at any cost. And she reversed all of her father's Protestant legislation. She married Philip II of Spain. He was also a highly devout Catholic monarch. And he was also the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and he was Mary's cousin, gross. And she executed several hundred Protestant resistors. She forced 1,000 Protestants to leave the country, and thus her nickname became Bloody Mary. Well, Mary died in 1558 after 5 years of being very unpopular. And Elizabeth I came to the throne, and she was a Protestant, so now we're going back the other way again. And so Elizabeth I was caught up in the middle between these two opposing religious forces. The Catholics wanted her to be Catholic, but now you also have these extreme Protestants who wanted to totally cleanse the Protestant Church of England of all the Catholic elements that her father, Henry VIII, had kept in it because he liked them. And so these extreme Protestants were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England. Remember also this, that the Church of England and the Anglican Church are two names for the exact same institution. In fact, the word Anglican comes from the name Angles, who were a Germanic tribe that settled large parts of Britain beginning in the 5th century. And so Anglican is where the word English actually comes from. So as queen, Elizabeth I had to kind of negotiate a middle ground and choose a middle course between these two extremes to make both sides happy. So Elizabeth took the Anglican Church into a moderately Protestant direction. All of her church and government officials had to swear that she was supreme in matters of politics and religion. But clergymen could marry. There would be no monasteries. Services were to be conducted in English rather than in Latin. But there would also be a Catholic-like hierarchy of bishops. Everyone was required to attend the Anglican Church, but the government would not interfere with private beliefs. So she was kind of steering this middle ground between the two. Elizabeth I had challenges from abroad. Elizabeth's cousin was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary was a devout Catholic, and in 1587 she was implicated in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth I. Philip II of Spain was also involved in the plan. Keep in mind, technically he was Elizabeth's brother-in-law because he had been married to her sister, Mary, who was now dead. But even if Mary, Queen of Scots, was herself innocent of the plot, she presented a clear danger to Elizabeth I just by being alive. Anybody could come and rescue Mary, Queen of Scots, and cause a revolt and a rebellion against Elizabeth I in Mary's name. So Elizabeth I had her cousin Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, executed. The Spanish Armada. The Pope urged Philip II of Spain to punish Elizabeth I for the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. And spies in England were telling Philip II that the English people, they really wanted to be Catholic again, and they hated their heretic queen, Elizabeth I, and that they would rise up and they would overthrow her for him if he would just send over a little encouragement. People always think that. And spies are notorious for telling you what you want to hear. So Philip II sent an armada of 130 ships to invade England. The Spanish Armada was a complete disaster for Philip II. Instead of rising up against their heretic queen, the English Navy fought the Spanish and fought hard, and the Spanish Armada was also not helped by all of the rough weather that they encountered. And so the Spanish Armada never got a suitable opportunity to invade the coast of England, and they ended up having to sail over the north end of Scotland and Ireland and go around the whole thing to get back home, and half of the Spanish Armada never made it back. Philip II eventually rebuilt his fleet with all the silver that he was bringing in from South America. But the English experienced a swell of national pride. They had this new image of themselves as the Protestant David, taking on all of these Catholic Goliaths like Spain. Well, this brings us all to John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, and Calvinism. Here was your solid proof that Christian humanists can be despots and tyrants. John Calvin was French. He was a Christian humanist. He met lots of Christian humanists in France. And John Calvin was a lawyer, and that's important because he thought like a lawyer, and he spoke and he wrote like a lawyer, and he viewed religion legalistically, and he often viewed religion in terms of crime and punishment. John Calvin's view of God's nature went like this. Calvin had a very Old Testament type view of the nature of God. In his mind, God was strict, God was judgmental, God was uncompromising, and God was not very merciful, not very gracious, and God was totally transcendent and totally all-knowing, and that God was unknowable, even through Scripture. Calvin's motto that he taught all of his followers was just suffer and obey. So John Calvin started preaching in his home country of France, and he quickly got into trouble in France, and so Calvin had to leave France and never return. And he lived for 3 years in the city of Basel, Switzerland. And then he moved to Geneva in the year 1536. And there's a quote of him right here in this picture: "Whoever believes in him will be saved. Unbelievers will be lost. I'm bound to preach to all who will hear. I am ready to dispute with you." And that sounds pretty inclusive. All is in there a couple of times, all. But then he qualifies it here. Are you the elect? And he says this: "Let us remember, on the other hand, that while life is promised universally to all who believe in Christ, still faith is not common to all. For Christ is made known and held out to the view of all, but the elect alone are they whose eyes God opens, that they may seek him by faith." The city of Geneva was going through a very energetic Protestant Reformation, and the city was looking for an able leader to guide them, and here came John Calvin. And so John Calvin started transforming the city of Geneva into his personal vision of the perfect Christian community. So let's talk about John Calvin and community structure. John Calvin had some ideas that were in common with Zwingli. Scripture was the only authority that you should recognize. The community should erase the lines between lay people and the clergy. Get rid of ornate structures. City government should enforce morality. And let me go into that a little bit about city government enforcing morality. See, if there's no church structure, if there's no line between the clergy and the lay people, then there's no reason to have two sets of moralities. For example, in this country, we have a value called separation of church and state, where there's a set of morality for the church and there's a set of morality for our government. And a lot of times those two moralities don't line up. And, we see that kind of tension and that conflict between those two moralities play out a lot in our news and the various issues that we have. But if there is no line between church structure and civic structure, then there's only one set of morality. There's only one enforcer of morality, and that's the city government. And you basically have, yes, a theocracy where religious leaders are in charge of your civic government. And so John Calvin enforced his will upon the entire community through a powerful group that was called the Consistory. And this Consistory was composed of both pastors and laymen, and they investigated deviations from proper doctrine and moral conduct of everybody in the city. And so from 1542 to 1546, the Consistory banished 76 people from Geneva, and they executed 58 people for such things as witchcraft and heresy and adultery and blasphemy. Calvin and predestination. Calvin believed that God already knows absolutely everything. Well, nothing remarkable about that. I mean, that's generally believed. And therefore, though, God must already know all of these things. He must already know who is going to heaven, which Calvin called the elect, and he must already know who all is going to hell, which Calvin called the reprobate. Now, in theory, you're not God, so you can't really know for sure which one you are. But in practice, it seemed pretty obvious to any Calvinist who was going to heaven and who was going to hell, who were the elect and who were the reprobate. These are John Calvin's own words regarding the elect and the reprobate. And he uses the word that he's best known for, predestination. And he says this: by predestination we mean the eternal decree of God by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regard to every man. All are not created on equal terms, but some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation. And accordingly, as each has been created for one or other of these ends, we say that he has been predestined to life or to death. John Calvin and the reprobate. If you lived in the community and you were considered one of the reprobate, then it was your duty to make sure that you didn't do anything to upset or offend the people who were predestined to go to heaven. You needed to be severely controlled and repressed to curtail your reprobate nature. And there were signs that you are predestined to go to hell: dancing, drinking, blaspheming, playing cards, etc. So spirituality is an inner thing and an outer thing. John Calvin and the elect, the good guys. If you bought into Calvin's beliefs, then the city of Geneva was a paradise for you. People flocked to Geneva from all over Europe to join Calvin's community. But if you didn't buy into Calvin's beliefs, then the city of Geneva was a living hell for you, because transgressors were punished publicly and severely. The spread of Calvinism. Calvin wrote a book in 1536 called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. This was the textbook on how to do Protestant church, and it was extremely popular. Calvin became an international hero, and Calvinism was spreading like wildfire. In France, you had the Huguenots. They were French Calvinists. It also went to England, went to Scotland with the Presbyterians. Why was Calvin so popular? I mean, when you look at this, you know, there's just something about it that makes you say, who would want to live this way? But Calvinism was popular because Calvinism was super simple and crystal clear. It gave simple answers to complex questions. It was all either yes or no, right or wrong. There were no gray areas. And keep in mind, like we've talked about, this was a time of great uncertainty with other church institutions and church sacraments. Also, Calvinism could go anywhere and put down roots easily. All you needed was a Bible and a copy of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and you were in business wherever you went. Everyone who buys in is part of the elect. Like if you're a Calvinist, you must be the elect, right? You must be predestined to go to heaven, because have you ever met a Calvinist who didn't think he was part of the elect? Why would you be a Calvinist if you didn't think you were part of the elect? Here's a fourth reason that Calvinism spread. City officials were attracted to it. It gave them more power over their own people. There was no papacy in Rome to have to deal with. There was no Catholic prince to have to deal with. And it was a way for them to differentiate themselves from those landed nobles in the eyes of the people. The Reformation in Eastern Europe. We haven't talked much about Eastern Europe. There were three places to the east of German-speaking lands that the Reformation impacted in one way or the other, and they were Poland, Lithuania, that's one place, not two, Bohemia, and that's the home of the Czechs and the Hussites, and Hungary. All three of these peoples associated the Protestant Reformation with Germans. Holy Roman Empire, they were mostly Germans. Wherever the Holy Roman Empire ruled, they installed their own German lords as the nobility for that region. The Holy Roman Empire was bad. Germans were bad. Martin Luther was German. The Reformation, also known as Lutheranism, was of German origin, and therefore the Protestant Reformation was not something you should want to get involved with. In Bohemia, most Czechs, as we learned in our summer reading room, were commoners and Hussites. Bohemia was ruled by an ethnic German nobility backed by the Holy Roman Empire, but the Czechs had fought hard to force the Holy Roman Empire to recognize their Hussite church. And the common Czech Hussite didn't have much use for their German nobility. Lutheranism had no appeal for Hussites. Lutheranism was a German thing, and they already had their own Hussite church, which they were quite happy with. A German noble was a German noble, and it made little difference to a Czech Hussite commoner whether a German noble was a Catholic or a Lutheran. As long as their German nobles recognized the Hussite church, Czechs didn't care. But then the Catholic Reformation, also known as the Counter Reformation, came through Bohemia, and this was a fresh, energized, vibrant, and militant brand of Catholicism. And these German nobles who had converted to Lutheranism in the 1520s and the 1530s now started to come back and return to Catholicism in the 1540s and 1550s. And it was now exciting to be a Catholic again, as we shall see when we study our next lesson. The Catholic Church was now on the advance and on the rise, and it had become a church that knew what it stood for, and it had a clear sense of mission, and this was going to make things more complicated and more challenging for the Hussites in Bohemia. What was it like in Poland, Lithuania? Starting in 1500, Poland and Lithuania were united under one king, one senate, and one parliament. And its territory was huge. But its 7.5 million population was sparse. And we talked about the mass migration that was going on in our summer reading. And Poland and Lithuania was an underpopulated place. Lots of Germans and Tartars and Italians and Jews were migrating into the area's towns, and local rulers wanted those immigrants coming in to provide wealth and expertise and economic progress to the country. When the Reformation rolled through the area, Lutheranism appealed to the Germans that were living in these towns, but native Poles saw Lutheranism as a German thing, so native Poles actually found Calvinism more appealing. Poland's native nobility liked that Calvinism gave more power to local leaders rather than having to listen to a big church bureaucracy. Also, Calvinism was of French origin, not German, and they liked that better. The king of Poland-Lithuania didn't like either Lutheranism or Calvinism. He was a staunch Catholic. Luckily for him, Lutheranism and Calvinism didn't play well together. Lutheranism and Calvinism could not team up against Catholicism. And when the Jesuits brought the Catholic Reformation, which we'll learn about next time, to Poland, Poland became staunchly Catholic once again. Both Bohemia and Poland-Lithuania were more impacted by the Counter Reformation than by the Protestant Reformation. And if you don't know what the Counter Reformation is, don't worry, you're going to hear all about that. Hungary was, of course, Catholic. It also happened, however, that a lot of Hungarian students were studying at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony, and that was Martin Luther's university. So Hungarian students were being taught about Lutheranism by Martin Luther himself for years and decades, because Martin Luther taught at the University of Wittenberg until he died. And these students were enthusiastically bringing Lutheranism to Hungary. Well, King Louis II of Hungary even got turned on to Lutheranism himself. However, Hungarian nobles and the Catholic Church labeled Lutheranism, quote, the German heresy. I mean, it's bad if it's just heresy. That's bad enough. It's super bad if it gets the name the German heresy. And the Hungarian Diet decreed in 1523 that all Lutherans were heretics. Their property was to be confiscated, and they were to be put to death. And so Hungary was getting ready to have a lot of violent internal conflict. All of that became irrelevant when Hungary got more trouble than anything it had ever faced before. Because in August of 1526, just as there was about to be a big showdown in the country over Lutheranism, the Ottoman Turks defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohács. King Louis II and many nobles were killed, and over 16,000 Hungarian soldiers were killed. And the Ottomans didn't really care whether you were Catholic or Protestant. You could become a Muslim, or you could pay the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims that they charged. And as long as you paid the jizya and you were not a polytheist, then you could practice Christianity or Judaism in a heavily restricted form. In the meantime, all of these former Hungarian University of Wittenberg students were coming back to Hungary and founding Lutheran parishes and schools. And the majority of Hungarians became Protestants for more than a century. But after 1683, the Ottoman Empire began to go into a decline. And at the same time, the Habsburg dynasty was consolidating its power in their home empire of Austria. So if you were a Hungarian, you would rather be ruled by Catholic Habsburgs than by Muslim Ottomans, because there's no tax for being a Christian under the Habsburgs. So the Hungarian nobles accepted Habsburg rule, and the Ottoman Empire withdrew from Hungary in the year 1699. The Habsburgs found the Hungarians to be very receptive to a Catholic restoration after having been ruled and taxed by the Ottoman Empire.